Hello my 3D printer peeps, I'm sitting here with a Creality Ender 3 V3 KE. And this KE has a tumor. I know, it's not a tumor. I have the dreaded blob of death. If you're here, you probably do too. Before we get started, I want to point out the blob of death is fairly rare, and the blob of death is user error. So go ahead, curse all you want, but take responsibility. Then take a deep breath and fix it. I'm going to work through the blob of death on a Creality Ender 3 version 3 KE. However, you can follow along on whatever version printer you have, as the process of resolving this is very similar. There are two causes of the blob of death. One, you have loose scrubs, screws, or something to that effect that caused a gap at the hot end, allowing filament to slip between that gap and ooze all over the place undetected until it was too late. Being sure that your hot end is warm, flush, and everything is snug will keep that gap from forming and that leak from happening and the blob of death from entering your life. The second way is for the print to detach from the print bed and you to not notice, allowing the printer to print continuously without anything actually adhering to the bed. This causes that blob to build up underneath the nozzle and then make its way all around everything, encasing your entire tool head and causing, of course, the blob of death. That's the case on my printer. On this machine, the print detached from the bed and was allowed to print for about 1,000 years undetected. This caused my giant tumor to form, and now I'm stuck with the blob of death. You can clearly see that was the case because there's all these detached prints sitting on my print bed. All these detached prints should be on the print bed, and they're not. They are actually all over the place, and some of the parts are even stuck to the bottom of the hot end. So, when diagnosing the cause of your problem, have a close look and determine if the filament leaked from a hot end gap or from your print detaching from the print bed and being left to continue. Regardless of this fact, you are stuck with the same problem, a giant filament tumor that you need to remove. There are a few things you will need to do this. A source of heat. I am going to use a low-cost heat gun. You really should have one of these in your print shop. The tools required to remove the tool head cover and any other parts of the tool head, including the hot end. Some small pliers and a few prying tools. I'm using a crafting weeder, and whatever this thing is, I also have a pair of snippers. Keep in mind, tools like snippers and a weeder will send you to the ER. Use them only if necessary, and use them with your head. If you are in tilt, which is a situation where you're angry and frustrated and no longer making good decisions, please take a break and come back later. Or, if you insist on continuing, do so without sharp objects. Let's get a little closer to the tool head and begin our surgery. This is the second blob of death I've ever had. That's well over 1,000 prints a year and only 2 blobs of death ever. One was a gap leak and the other is a detached print. I tell you this because I want you to understand this is a real world situation. This is not a blob of death I fabricated for this video. This is my actual printer, and this is an actual blob of death, and we are going to tackle it right now on camera. Your very first step is to get the tool head cover off. Every printer is different, yet somewhat the same. On the KE, you've got a few screws, one on this side and 2 on this side. Over here, you will have a cable for the fan. Disconnect that cable. And unfortunately, there's another cable for the second fan that runs behind the hot end. I am going to go ahead and remove that wire. Pull that wire through, and your tool head cover is off. And now you can go ahead and proceed without potentially destroying your cooling fans or tool head cover. The blob of death. I am going to turn my Z-rod here and bring the blob up higher to give me some more room to work, and again to avoid putting the heat and other tools near any other critical parts of my printer. This is a pretty nasty blob. There are some people that will tell you to heat the hot end. This is something that's possible if these hot end wires right here, the thermistor and the heater, are not damaged. However, with all of this swelling, who knows what's actually going on under there? And if they are damaged, it's possible they are shorting, and you could damage other parts of your printer or possibly even electrocute yourself. I'm going to suggest not attempting to heat this up and remove the blob. Instead, removing the blob using a heat gun and simply swapping out the hot end. If you think your blob is small enough and safe enough, you could try heating this hot end and working this blob off and maybe being able to go right back to work. My situation is pretty dire and I'm not going to go that route. Let's go ahead and attempt to remove this blob of death using a heat gun. Our goal is to gain access to the hot end screws and remove the entire hot end. This is my Creality hot end kit, and this is what we are attempting to remove and replace. In the back of your tool head, you will see the CR Touch. If possible, remove the CR Touch. I am going to take the Sprite cable, fold it up, and push it behind this lead screw to get it out of the way. When you remove this cable, be careful. Creality likely has a little bit of hot glue on that connection. Hot glue is not strong. You should be able to easily pry it off. Do so without breaking any wires. You now have access to the entire blob without any sensitive cabling or hardware in the way. Just kidding, you still have tons of sensitive hardware and cabling in the way. Push that cable out of the way and you have less sensitive cabling and hardware in the way. If you have access to this grub screw, loosen it now. We now want to gain access to the other two grub screws underneath the hot end. They are buried by my blob. Now is a good time to follow the thermistor and heater wire from your hot end and disconnect them. There you go. And here's the other. Glue chunk first, connection second. When yanking it off, be sure to actually grab either the connector or the wire and don't pull on the fitting on the board because we are replacing this. It's okay if you break it. It is not okay if you break the board. With the heater and thermistor disconnected, it's time to begin softening this blob using heat. You'll notice I didn't point at the thermistor or heater wire because at some point I might accidentally say the wrong thing and somebody will throw a fit and cry in the comments. Break out your heat gun or whatever heat source you have, break it out and let's get going. And I'm going to start working on my blob. Keeping in mind the main goal is to remove this hot end by gaining access to the two screws and the grub behind it. I've got my heat gun set to 450. Remember guys, we are dealing with filament. Filament melts. We don't need to crank on this. We don't need to cut it with clippers. We simply need to soften it to make it melt. I'm focusing on a joint between this big blob right here in hopes of being able to get it off and start gaining closer access to the actual hot end. Oh, would you look at that. One of your first goals should be getting the silicone boot away. Keep in mind, when working on your blob, you don't have to melt and remove the entire blob. You simply have to melt and remove the section of the blob that is clinging to your tool head. The rest of the blob will come with it. We do not want to crank on this. You see how there's some movement? We don't want to warp, bend, damage, scratch, or compromise in any way this tool head, its brackets, or the linear rails it's riding on. Just through the softness of the filament. I am upping my temperature to 475. It's a serious tumor, and it's gonna be pretty hard. Yours might be easier. If it's this big, you're gonna need to be patient and just soften up as much of this blob that's in touch with the hot end as possible. Once it gets soft, like bubble gum, you should be able to stretch it off. I'm moving my heat to 500 degrees. Weeder tool. Once you gain access to this grub screw right here, put your tool in and loosen it all the way. Right there in that center hole. You have now released the grub screw from the heat break on your hot end. I've got some movement here, which is great. The silicone boot is off, which is great. The silicone boot will actually insulate and protect the blob from the heat. So with that off, I can get much closer to the actual hot end now to gain access to those screws and remove the hot end. Beautiful. Can you see it? That's the first screw on the hot end. I now just have to keep working around to the other side and get access to that screw. Then we remove this whole blob, whatever remains of it, in one complete piece. And there it is, the blob of death. I'll tell you what, it does look like the heater and thermostat are still intact and this hot end can be saved. However, I am not going to do that. Let's go ahead and replace this hot end. Fortunately, the new hot end comes with a new silicone boot. If you were to try and save this hot end, you would need to replace this boot. Doing this is super easy. You've already loosened the grub in the back. Now loosen this grub and this grub. Something you're also going to want to do is heat up around the screw and remove any excess filament that might be jammed in around that screw. Because you might actually come to think you have a stripped screw. What you really have is hard filament encasing that screw, literally gluing it in place. Then what's going to happen is you are going to strip the head because you can't possibly get enough torque to break that hard filament free. With everything still soft and warm, without burning yourself, work those two screws off. When the filament was cold and hard, I could not get either screw to move. Now, both screws move easily. And the hot end, formerly encased in the blob of death, is off. This right here, when inserted up into the heatsink, if it's not flush, the gap between this and the throat of the heatsink is what forms the blob of death. Take the new hot end. There is a lump. Put that lump towards the back. Put some thermal grease, not the kind of stuff you'd use for a CPU. This will be different. I will put a link in the description, but if you have Bamboo or Creality printers, chances are you have something that came with a tube of their brand thermal grease. Go ahead and put a little bit here. I put a lot and it's super ugly, but keep in mind, I do things for the visual on the camera. You do not need this much. However, I'd rather too much than too little. Preferably with everything still warm, slide the new hot end into place. With good firm upward pressure, tighten that grub screw in the back of the heatsink. This grub right here is the leading cause of blobs of death. This is super important. This grub screw will sink into this hole and make contact with the heat break. When it does, it will secure this nozzle. If your grub is stopping early and feels like it's firm, it may trick you. You must check and see if you can turn or remove this hot end. If you can, the grub screw is full of SHIT and you need the strongest tool you can get, maybe even a screwdriver like this, and get it in there tight and firmly and carefully work that grub until it is well into that socket and making contact with this hot end. If it is not doing that, work with it till it is. Once you feel the hot end is no longer moving, secure it with the two side bolts. That does require, unfortunately, removing the silicone boot. It's just silicone, work it off. My grub screw required so much force, I was afraid I would break my tool or strip the grub. Turn both of these until they're firm, and then adjust each one a little bit more. Try your darndest not to overdo it and strip these heads, or else you are going to have a nightmare in the future. Your hot end should be super firm with no movement at all. No movement at all. Replace the silicone boot. The blob of death is removed and your printer has a brand new hot end. Reattach everything, put it back together, and run a full calibration. You are ready to get back to work. And there we are, from the agony of defeat to the thrill of victory. I'm Mr. Greg. This is the Blob of Death. And you're on 3D Rundown. Ow, fuck.